There's a common belief that deserves closer examination before we begin. Most people assume that after betraying an empath, the narcissist simply moves on. They find someone new, repeat the same patterns, and leave the past behind without a second thought. From the outside, that often appears to be exactly what happens. But appearances and psychology are not always the same thing. Today, we're going to examine something much deeper: why betraying an empath often creates consequences the narcissist cannot truly recover from. Not because they suddenly become overwhelmed with guilt, and not because they finally understand the pain they caused, but because the betrayal quietly damages something their own psychology depends upon far more than they usually recognize. Let's begin with an important distinction. When we say a narcissist cannot recover, we are not necessarily talking about visible suffering. We're talking about psychological loss. Those are not always the same thing. A person can appear successful, confident, socially active, even happy, while internally becoming increasingly dependent on defenses that grow more fragile with time. Understanding this distinction is essential because many people spend years waiting for obvious signs of regret that may never arrive. The deeper consequences often remain invisible, even to the narcissist himself. The first reason betraying an empath creates such a profound internal consequence is this: the narcissist destroys one of the few relationships capable of reflecting genuine acceptance rather than admiration. Throughout this series, we've explored how narcissistic psychology depends heavily upon external validation. Praise, attention, admiration, status, and control all function as temporary ways of regulating an unstable sense of self. An empath offers something fundamentally different. A genuine empath does not simply admire another person. They attempt to understand them. They become curious about hidden fears. They remain present during emotional difficulty. They often extend patience long after most people would have walked away. This kind of acceptance is extremely rare. Ironically, it is also the very thing the narcissist is least prepared to receive. Instead of recognizing its value, the narcissist often interprets it as certainty. If the empath keeps forgiving, surely they will forgive again. If they remain after repeated disappointments, surely they will always remain. This assumption quietly becomes one of the greatest psychological miscalculations the narcissist ever makes. Because eventually, the empath reaches a limit. Not suddenly, not dramatically, gradually. The day arrives when understanding no longer outweighs self-respect. Compassion no longer overrides reality. Hope no longer defeats evidence. And when the empath finally leaves, something irreplaceable disappears. Not because no one else will ever love the narcissist, but because very few people will ever invest in understanding them with that same depth again. The narcissist often mistakes quantity for quality. They believe another relationship can simply replace the previous one. Another admirer, another partner, another source of attention. What they fail to recognize is that attention can be replaced. Authentic emotional investment cannot. This creates the first irreversible loss. There is another reason this betrayal becomes psychologically significant. The narcissist often depends upon predictable emotional reactions from the empath. Think about the familiar pattern. The narcissist withdraws. The empath pursues understanding. The narcissist creates confusion. The empath seeks clarity. The narcissist withholds affection. The empath increases emotional effort. Over time, these reactions become expected, almost automatic. The narcissist unconsciously learns that emotional distance produces pursuit. Silence produces anxiety. Inconsistency produces greater investment. These expectations become part of the relationship's emotional structure. Then something changes. The empath stops reacting. Messages receive no emotional response. Arguments no longer become opportunities for explanation. Manipulation no longer creates confusion. The familiar cycle simply ends. This change often feels profoundly disorienting. Not because the narcissist suddenly develops empathy, because their emotional predictions stop working. Psychologically, humans rely heavily upon predictability. When expected responses suddenly disappear, uncertainty replaces control. For someone whose sense of stability depends heavily upon controlling interpersonal dynamics, this uncertainty becomes deeply unsettling. There is another psychological loss worth understanding. The narcissist often constructs an internal narrative in which they remain the central figure in every important relationship. Even after separation, they frequently assume they continue occupying significant emotional space in the other person's life. This assumption protects self-esteem. It maintains the belief that their importance remains unquestioned. But a genuinely healed empath quietly challenges this narrative without saying a word. They stop organizing their emotional life around the narcissist. They build new routines, new friendships, new goals, new sources of meaning. The narcissist gradually discovers that they are no longer the emotional center of someone else's world. For most people, this would simply be part of life. For narcissistic psychology, however, it represents something much larger. It threatens the belief that they remain uniquely significant. Another important point deserves attention. Many people imagine that the narcissist's greatest fear is abandonment. While abandonment may certainly feel threatening, something even deeper often exists beneath it. The fear of becoming emotionally irrelevant. An empath who has genuinely healed no longer revolves around the narcissist's approval, criticism, attention, or absence. This emotional independence quietly removes the influence the narcissist once relied upon. Power fades, control weakens, predictability disappears. The relationship can no longer function according to the old psychological rules. And perhaps this is where the deepest consequence begins. Not because the narcissist finally understands what they destroyed, but because they gradually discover that some people cannot simply be replaced. Some relationships provide something no amount of charm, success, or attention can recreate. The tragedy is that this realization often arrives only after the relationship has already become impossible to restore. And by then, the empath has usually undergone a transformation that makes returning to the old dynamic psychologically impossible. That is where we'll continue in part 2, because the greatest consequence of betraying an empath is not what happens to the empath. It's what permanently changes inside the narcissist's own psychological world once that source of genuine emotional investment is gone forever. If losing the empath creates the first fracture, the next question becomes even more important. Why can't the narcissist simply replace what they lost and move on? From the outside, it often looks as though they do exactly that. A new relationship appears, new photographs, new declarations of happiness, new promises, new beginnings. To anyone watching from a distance, it can seem as though the previous relationship meant very little. But psychology asks a different question. Not whether another relationship exists, but whether it serves the same psychological function. These are two very different things. Throughout this series, we've explored an important distinction between attention and genuine emotional connection. Attention can come from many places: a new partner, friends, social media, professional success, status, recognition. All of these can temporarily reinforce a person's sense of importance. But genuine emotional investment, the kind an empath often offers, is much more difficult to replace. An empath doesn't simply admire someone. They study them. They remember details. They notice subtle emotional changes. They invest extraordinary amounts of emotional energy into understanding another person's inner world. That level of investment is exceptionally rare. The narcissist often assumes another person will naturally provide it. Instead, they discover something frustrating. Most people have limits. Most people notice repeated inconsistencies much earlier. Most people leave after patterns become obvious. Most people refuse to endlessly explain away behavior that repeatedly damages trust. The narcissist begins encountering something they experienced very little with the empath. Consequences, not dramatic consequences, predictable ones. People stop responding. People lose interest. People establish boundaries. People choose distance. Each relationship becomes slightly shorter, slightly more difficult, slightly less convincing. This creates an important psychological problem. The narcissist often believes the solution is simply finding a better partner, someone more understanding, more forgiving, more patient, more loyal. But the issue was never the empath's inability to love. It was the narcissist's inability to sustain mutual trust. Changing partners cannot solve a pattern that travels with the person creating it. This leads to another invisible consequence. Over time, relationships stop feeling emotionally meaningful. Instead, they become emotionally functional. They exist primarily to regulate self-esteem, to reduce loneliness, to restore admiration, to maintain identity. When relationships become tools instead of connections, something essential is quietly lost: depth, vulnerability, mutual growth. None of these qualities can flourish inside a relationship built primarily around emotional regulation. This creates a cycle. Each new relationship begins with excitement, hope, idealization. For a brief period, everything feels possible. The narcissist experiences the familiar emotional high that accompanies fresh admiration. Then reality slowly appears. Ordinary disagreements emerge, boundaries appear, imperfections become impossible to ignore. The same psychological defenses activate again. Criticism increases, emotional withdrawal appears, blame replaces accountability. The cycle quietly restarts. Each repetition reinforces the illusion that the problem always exists outside. Wrong partner, wrong timing, wrong circumstances. Very rarely does the narcissist examine the internal pattern connecting every relationship together. There is another consequence that deserves careful attention. The narcissist gradually loses access to genuine emotional mirrors. An empath reflects more than admiration. They often reflect possibility. They encourage growth. They notice strengths the narcissist struggles to see. They offer reassurance during moments of insecurity. Ironically, these are some of the very qualities the narcissist eventually devalues. After the empath leaves, future relationships often become increasingly superficial. People may admire achievements, compliment appearance, celebrate success, but very few invest the emotional effort necessary to truly understand them. Without realizing it, the narcissist becomes increasingly surrounded by attention while becoming increasingly deprived of authentic connection. This is a profound psychological contradiction: externally admired, internally isolated. Another important shift begins taking place. The narcissist slowly becomes more suspicious. Repeated relationship failures create a subtle expectation that everyone eventually leaves. Instead of producing greater self-awareness, this expectation often strengthens defensive behavior. trust decreases, control increases, emotional openness becomes even more threatening. Vulnerability feels increasingly dangerous. As a result, future relationships begin with more emotional walls than the previous ones. Those walls protect against rejection. They also prevent intimacy. The very strategy designed to avoid pain quietly guarantees continued loneliness. Perhaps the greatest irony appears here. The narcissist often wanted unconditional admiration. The empath offered something much healthier: conditional trust built upon repeated opportunities for honesty. Instead of valuing that opportunity, the narcissist repeatedly tested its limits. Eventually, those limits were reached. By the time the empath finally walked away, the relationship had already accumulated years of unresolved disappointment. Many people ask whether the narcissist misses the empath. The answer is more complicated than people expect. Often, they miss the emotional stability the empath unknowingly provided. They miss the predictability, the forgiveness, the reassurance, the attention, the belief that someone would continue trying no matter how inconsistent the relationship became. But missing emotional regulation is not the same as understanding emotional loss. One reflects dependence, the other reflects insight. Those are entirely different psychological experiences. This explains why reconciliation attempts frequently focus on restoring the relationship rather than repairing the pattern. The narcissist seeks relief from emotional discomfort. The empath seeks evidence of genuine change. One looks for immediate stability. The other looks for lasting transformation. Without transformation, the same cycle simply begins again. And perhaps this is why betraying an empath becomes so psychologically costly. Not because the narcissist suddenly develops overwhelming guilt, but because they gradually lose one of the few people willing to invest extraordinary emotional energy without demanding perfection in return. Once that person is gone, and once the empath has rebuilt their identity around self-respect instead of self-sacrifice, that particular form of connection becomes extraordinarily difficult to find again. If losing the empath creates an emotional void that cannot simply be replaced, the final question becomes the most important of all. Why does the narcissist often spend years trying to recreate what they lost, yet never truly succeeds? The answer has very little to do with the empath as an individual. It has everything to do with what the relationship quietly provided. Throughout this series, we've explored the difference between external validation and internal stability. This distinction becomes crucial here. A narcissist can often find new admiration. They can attract attention. They can impress new people. They can create another exciting beginning. But beginnings and stability are not the same thing. The admiration that comes from a new relationship is temporary. It depends on novelty, curiosity, possibility. The empath, however, often offered something much deeper. They continued investing emotionally even after imperfections became visible. They remained during disappointment. They searched for understanding instead of immediately withdrawing. For someone whose identity relies heavily on outside reassurance, that level of emotional investment becomes extraordinarily valuable. Ironically, it is often appreciated only after it has disappeared. There is another psychological consequence that deserves careful attention. Every relationship teaches us something about ourselves. Healthy relationships reinforce trust, mutual respect, honest communication, growth. Unhealthy patterns reinforce something different: defensiveness, control, emotional distance. The narcissist often leaves relationships believing the problem was always external: wrong partner, wrong circumstances, bad timing. Because the underlying pattern remains unexamined, each new relationship begins with the same psychological blueprint: different faces, different names, the same emotional structure. This explains why similar conflicts often repeat despite completely different partners. The circumstances change, the pattern remains. Another important shift takes place after the empath leaves. The narcissist frequently discovers that emotional influence cannot be demanded. It must be willingly given. Earlier in the relationship, they may have assumed they could predict the empath's reactions. Silence would create pursuit. Distance would create anxiety. Inconsistency would increase emotional investment. These expectations slowly became part of the relationship itself. When the empath genuinely heals, those familiar responses disappear. The old emotional leverage no longer exists. Messages no longer receive immediate replies. Attempts to provoke guilt fail. Emotional games produce silence instead of confusion. For perhaps the first time, the narcissist encounters a reality they cannot easily control. This experience can feel profoundly unsettling, not necessarily because of love, but because predictability has vanished. Control has been replaced by uncertainty. There is another irony worth understanding. Many narcissists spend years trying to recover the emotional certainty they once experienced with the empath. They may seek it through new relationships, professional success, public admiration, financial achievement, status, recognition. Each accomplishment provides temporary relief. Yet relief gradually fades. Why? Because external achievements can strengthen an image. They cannot replace emotional security. If self-worth depends entirely on outside confirmation, every source of confirmation eventually becomes insufficient. More attention is required, more success, more admiration. The cycle never reaches completion because the underlying need remains unchanged. This creates a quiet psychological exhaustion. From the outside, life may appear impressive. Inside, stability remains dependent upon constant reinforcement. That dependence often grows stronger rather than weaker over time. Meanwhile, something very different is happening in the empath's life. Instead of searching for someone to restore their identity, the empath begins rebuilding it from within. They strengthen friendships, develop interests, reconnect with forgotten dreams, establish healthier boundaries, learn to trust their own perception again. Little by little, emotional security becomes less dependent upon another person's approval. This creates one of the greatest differences between their two journeys. The empath gradually needs less external validation. The narcissist often continues needing more. The distance between those two psychological paths becomes greater with every passing year. Another important realization emerges. The narcissist often mistakes access for connection. Having someone's attention does not necessarily mean having their trust. Receiving affection does not necessarily mean receiving genuine emotional intimacy. Being desired does not necessarily mean being deeply known. The empath frequently offered all three: attention, trust, authentic emotional investment. After betrayal, future relationships may continue providing attention while never reaching the same emotional depth. Not because such depth is impossible, because authentic intimacy requires qualities narcissistic defenses often make difficult: humility, accountability, vulnerability, the willingness to acknowledge mistakes without collapsing into shame or immediately shifting blame elsewhere. Without these qualities, intimacy remains limited. Relationships may continue. Connection remains shallow. Perhaps this is the deepest consequence of all. The narcissist often spends years searching for the emotional experience they believe another person created. In reality, that experience depended upon a relationship dynamic they themselves eventually destroyed. No new partner can recreate trust that has never been consistently protected. No amount of charm can permanently replace genuine accountability. No amount of admiration can substitute for authentic emotional closeness. This is why the statement that a narcissist cannot recover deserves careful interpretation. It does not mean change is impossible. People are capable of growth when they genuinely commit to deep self examination, accountability, and sustained psychological work. What it does mean is that without that kind of fundamental change, simply moving on to another relationship does not resolve the underlying pattern. The faces change, the circumstances change, the emotional cycle remains remarkably similar, and that is the quiet tragedy. The empath's greatest lesson after betrayal is learning that self-respect must become stronger than the desire to save every relationship. The narcissist's greatest challenge after betrayal is confronting the possibility that the very defenses once used to protect the self may now be preventing the very connection they have been searching for all along. In the end, the empath's healing moves toward increasing inner stability. The narcissist's struggle often continues until the pattern itself, not just the partner, is honestly confronted. That is why the deepest consequence of betraying an empath is not simply losing one relationship. It is losing the opportunity that relationship offered, the chance to build something rooted in honesty, mutual accountability, and genuine emotional intimacy. When that opportunity is repeatedly sacrificed without meaningful change, it cannot be replaced simply by finding someone new. Because the problem was never the absence of another person. It was the absence of the internal transformation required to create a different outcome.